Well, the government's budget may be in a state of collapse, the fastest collapse of a budget since the pasty tax omni-shambles. But the Tories are still 19 points in the lead in the opinion polls, and Donald Trump's circus becomes ever more surreal. Who'll be first to be sent to jail? His former national security advisor, or his Attorney General, or himself? We'll be talking about three subjects principally this evening, though others may tangentially intrude. The first is the state of the country's finances. Now, I have been, I hate to admit this, listening to budgets for almost 50 years. I know, I was a childhood protege, but I have never heard a more boring, meaningless budget than the one I thought I was listening to, delivered by Spreadsheet Phil. See, I pronounced that properly, because hey, it can go wrong. Spreadsheet Phil is a desiccated chartered accountant from a provincial practice who has somehow wandered onto the Westminster stage and found himself in quick succession the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs and then Chancellor of the Exchequer, when he's plainly not qualified to be either, or even to be a high-level clerk in either department. He, it was, who introduced a budget of such complacency, such otherworldliness, that I could hardly believe what I was listening to. You wouldn't have thought, listening to Spreadsheet Phil, that Britain was a country adrift in a sea of troubles, that our pensioners had just shivered through another austerity winter, that our public service workers were not entering their eighth year without a pay rise of any kind. You would never have imagined that Britain was in a country where our health service was in a state of crisis and collapse, where patients are on trolleys, if they're lucky to get a trolley, in a corridor where doctors are weeping into television cameras at the pressure that they are under, where the GPs are up in arms. Listening to Spreadsheet Phil, you would never have imagined that this was a country in which social care, that is to say, non-medical care for the chronically sick and the aged elderly who are not bed blocking in the NHS but are supposed to be being looked after at home, was in a multi-billion pound deficit, such that scenes that have never been seen in Britain since Dickensian times, of old, infirm, unwell people literally wandering the streets, not knowing where they are, cannot be far away. And yet Spreadsheet Phil, I'm continuing to say this properly, was wandering around Westminster making lame dad jokes that weren't funny when they were first cracked 10,000 times ago. And then he pulled a rabbit out of the hat. What kind of a rabbit was it? Actually, it was more a rodent than a rabbit. He broke the Conservative Party's oft-repeated manifesto pledge that under them there will be no increase in income tax or national insurance contributions, quote, unquote. He did it. He said, in the interests of fairness, we're not going to reduce the national insurance contribution of people on PAYE. We're going to increase the national insurance contributions of those who are not. The entrepreneurs, the cab drivers, the one man or one woman, two man or two women businesses, the kind of people who are out there taking risks, risking their own money, working all the hours that God sends, with no security whatsoever, trying to make a business for themselves, and by so doing, driving the British economy's uptick. They are to be penalised with an increase of many hundreds of pounds just for, well, in the interests of fairness. Well, it went down not like a lead balloon, but a balloon filled with spreadsheet. It went down with the right-wing press, with the tabloids, and with other media like a lead balloon to the power of 10. And Tory MPs started revolting. I know, it's a terrible thought, a terrible sight, a revolting Tory MP. But they told the government that up with this they will not put. And on day 2 of the budget, the Tories have collapsed and withdrawn what was, by anybody's standards, an important flagship part of their budget. And yet, this shambolic government, with an unelected, unprepossessing Prime Minister, is 19 points ahead in the latest YouGov opinion poll. That'll be YouGov that failed to predict Brexit, that failed to predict so many contests in recent times. But for the purposes of argument, we're going to assume that they are this time accurate. 19 points ahead, with Labour down at 25, levels that have not been seen since the SDP split assumed the Tories to have a landslide victory in 1983, back when the Right Honourable and much missed Michael Foot was the leader of the Labour Party. The Tories must be regretting now that they passed this Fixed-Term Parliament Act. Otherwise, they might cut and run, seeking to achieve an overwhelming Tory majority in the Commons, which would mean that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor could introduce any kind of tax measure, and the MPs would have to vote it through. You see, with a Commons majority nominally of 12, Theresa May is subject to, if not blackmail, then moral pressure from her backbenchers in a way that must be very uncomfortable for her. We'll be talking to some experts, real experts, Professor John Curtis, on that subject, the opinion poll issue, in the second hour of the show. And in the third hour, we'll be talking about the United States of America. Now, everybody knows, I think, where I stand on Donald Trump. I said that it was a hell of a choice between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and I would not be able to make it. Thus, I advocated to my friends in the United States that they voted for the Green Party presidential candidate, Dr. Jill Stein. But not enough of them did, and certainly not enough of the voters in the swing states voted for Hillary Clinton. So, we're landed with Donald Trump. Now, if Donald Trump does what he says he's going to do on the international level and on the local US economic industrial model, well, he might go down as a great president. But there's a gigantic if in that sentence. It's at least 20 foot tall and, frankly, getting taller. The travails of the Trump administration have gone into levels that are positively surreal. I happen to have met General Michael Flynn. I didn't say so, I think, before, because, hey, I met him in Moscow and he was already in enough trouble on that front. He had to resign because he supposedly lied to the Vice President of the US about his contacts with Russians in the interregnum between Trump's election victory and his taking office. It turns out that Flynn is almost certainly not a Russian agent, but he very definitely is, because he's just admitted it, an agent of the Turkish government, being paid more than £500,000 secretly without declaring it in order to be a spokesman, a lobbyist for them. It's all coming up over the next 2.5 hours or so. It's the mother of all talk shows. I've been verbally, I hope, extremely clear about what the political situation is at Westminster as it looks to me from the outside. But we're going to hear now from a man who's very much inside, and there's nothing he doesn't know about what's going on in the corridors of power. He's Andrew Woodcock, and he's political editor at the Press Association. Andrew, thanks very much for joining us.
Good evening, George.
Andrew, the government's not precarious, but slim House of Commons majority makes them really vulnerable to any issue that irks a sufficiently large number, and it doesn't have to be large, of Tory MPs. He ought to have seen this white van coming, hadn't he?
I think so. I think breaching a manifesto commitment in the way that he undoubtedly did was something that was always going to cause problems for Philip Hammond. I think White Van Man is a very important constituency for the Conservatives. It's a sort of swing constituency of a kind of people who they could vote Tory, they could vote Labour. They're increasing numbers of them are now voting UKIP, and it's a sort of constituency that every Conservative MP will be wanting to nurture in their own seats. I think the interesting thing this week has been that we've had a tremendously long honeymoon for Theresa May, and this budget may well have marked the end of that period. She's enjoyed sort of fabulous approval ratings in the polls. She's won that not necessarily by people being particularly enthusiastic about her, but by the idea that she's trustworthy, she's reliable, she's competent, she gets the job done. And this budget has pulled the rug under that for a variety of reasons.
Well, I'll come to her in a minute. Let me stick with him briefly. We're kind of used in this country, certainly in my time in Parliament, to the Chancellor of the Exchequer being a big figure, being a putative or at least possible Prime Minister, often a rival of the Prime Minister, a big figure. I'm talking Nigel Lawson, I'm talking Norman Lamont, I'm talking Gordon Brown, perhaps preeminently. Philip Hammond just doesn't fit that bill, does he? He's a desiccated local, provincial accountant, isn't he?
Well, he's someone who's his reputation in part stems on his apparent lack of ambition. He's someone who's risen to Chancellor without ever particularly appearing to want to lead his party or want to gather acolytes around him. He's certainly very different in that sense from his predecessor, George Osborne, who definitely saw himself as the Prime Minister in waiting, and as you say, Gordon Brown even more so than that. I think Philip Hammond, his appeal to Theresa May is precisely that he was someone who she could rely on to be sensible and to be reliable without challenging her in any way. And you have to wonder that if a leading politician has not got his eye on the main chance and the possibility that he might get the top job, does that blunt his political antennae? Does that stop him from thinking of the possible pitfalls that lie in wait for him?
Good point, Andrew. But of course, the buck stops with the Prime Minister. If he is a dullard, and I believe that he is, she presumably is not, and certainly can't afford to be. And she must have signed off on this budget. I know that Tony Blair was sometimes blinded by Gordon Brown's science and kind of left it up to him, but that cannot surely be the case here. In which case, she didn't see the white van coming either.
No, I think that the problem they have is that they were fixated on the issue of social care and the need to find some money from somewhere that they could wave around and say we're dealing with this because social care, the NHS crisis was becoming a major headache for Mrs May. Equally, the whole business rates issue. I think they looked at those headaches. They thought we've got to find the money somewhere, and this seemed like a little tweak that they could sell as being an issue of fairness. They could say the self-employed have in fact been getting these extra benefits over the years. They've been improving their position, and they're actually now better off than the people who are employed. I think also there's the point that as you look at the way that the world of work is changing, there are going to be more and more self-employed people as the years go by, and the Treasury is looking at that. I'm thinking the more self-employed people there are, the more people who are hiring themselves out to companies as in the gig economy, the more they're going to be losing revenue from taxes, because people just aren't paying through PAYE anymore, and they're minimising their national insurance liabilities, and so taking advantage of all sorts of little ways of reducing tax they pay.
How badly do you think this has damaged them, Andrew?
Well, I don't think it's not a fatal blow by any manner of means. I mean, the Tories at the moment are in such a dominant position in the polls. They're so dominant in Westminster that they can take this sort of blow and they can stride on. I think it is interesting in that it probably marks the end of the real honeymoon period, and people will now be looking at Theresa May and looking at Philip Hammond and thinking they are fallible. They're not as reliable as we thought. And also, it raises a big question about trust, because a manifesto pledge, if you're going to break it, then you really have to be open about breaking. You have to get out there and say, this is something that is really important that we do. We're sorry that we're breaking a promise, but it has to be done. Instead, they tried to weasel their way out of it with all sorts of strange excuses, which I don't think will wash very well with the electorate.
Andrew, thanks as always. Andrew Woodcock, political editor at the Press Association, talking about the aftermath of the budget 2017. Now, coming up later in the programme, we'll look at the first post-budget poll with Professor John Curtis, the doyen of political scientists and psephologists. In the first hour, we're talking about the omni-shambles which the 2017 budget has already turned out to be. Budgets are normally a big hit on day one, and then as people ferret through the undergrowth over subsequent days and weeks, no budget survives entirely contact with reality. This budget scarcely survived the sitting down of the Chancellor. Philip Hammond, a man overwhelmingly underqualified for this position, in my view, has made a terrible blunder, a pasty tax level of blunder, with his tax increase for entrepreneurs, taxi drivers, one man, one woman businesses, white van man, white van woman. I'm sure that there are white van women, and they're all very, very angry, and so are their voices in the popular press. Let's hear from Grant in London on this subject. Grant, go ahead, sir.
Good evening, Jules. A pleasure to speak to you, sir.
Thank you.
This tax is aimed at, like you said, the entrepreneurs, people like me, a black cab driver in London, who's self-employed. You know, I've never been so healthy since I was self-employed, because I can't afford a day off, George. Everything's going up. I have to work 5-6 days a week to keep my head above water. And if I just may take you back to last year, George, you delivered a speech outside 10 Downing Street to a throng of cab drivers.
I did.
Every word. You did, George. And we was protesting about the government and Uber and Osborne and Cameron's intervention with Boris.
Yes.
And I always remember, George, very clearly you stated to us that somewhere along the line money would be changing hands about Uber. And my God, are you right? We've just seen Osborne working for BlackRock 1 day a week, £650,000 a year salary, and BlackRock is one of the biggest investors in Uber. So you were so on the money, George. It was frightening, my friend.
I'm usually on the money, Grant. Unfortunately, not making it. I'm like you, Grant. I'm in the gig economy, as they call it. I have to make my wages. If I didn't show up tonight, I wouldn't be paid. If you didn't go out with your cab tonight, you wouldn't be paid. Can't afford to be sick. Have to think twice. I mean, I go on holiday, but I have to come back in order to do my TV and radio shows. That's the world we live in, and it has its upsides and its downsides. And one of its upsides has just been wiped out by the very same Tory government that you are talking about. Now, I was on the money about the money changing hands between the Tories and Uber and their owners, their ultimate owners. But even I failed to foresee that George Osborne, that miserable little figure, would be worth £655,000 a year for 1 day a week's work for BlackRock. Even I couldn't have seen that one, Grant. What is that money for? What talents, what ability is he bringing to the table? What value is he adding to that company that could conceivably be worth that amount of money?
I think in the old days you would call it payback, George, yeah? And when I look at that, this is the man who done a deal, and I love that word, a deal with Google for £130 million for 10 years worth of tax. For Google, that's like me and you getting a tax bill through the door in January for £25, George.
Yep.
If the government is so skint, if the NHS and the education system is on its knees, then by Christ, why don't they go after the big corporations and not after the little man? £200 a year off of all our self-employed. Why not go after Google, Amazon, Starbucks? Pay your tax in the UK, gents. That's why we're skint, because so many big companies are not paying their way, George. And all the workers they have, they're using schools, they're using hospitals. I mean, it's a darn liberty, George.
It is. I doubt this is the first call of the night. I doubt if we'll get many better ones. Let me just put this last point to you, Grant. This revolving door between Parliament and government and the private sector, which Parliament and government regulates and oversees, really took wing under the Tony Blair administration. It was under that administration where minister after minister was out the door and into the revolving door, and then sitting on the board or working as an employee with the very companies that had been being granted either big contracts, in some cases mega big contracts, or in the case of Google, given extremely generous, let's call it that, sweetheart tax arrangements. And then the guy who gave them that arrangement walks onto their board, and we're asked to believe that for 1 day a week he's worth £655,000. I ask again, Grant, I doubt if you or I have the answer, what conceivable value, what conceivable ability could George Osborne have to command that salary for a 1 day a week gig? Talk about a gig economy. That's one hell of a gig. The Rolling Stones would be lucky to land a gig like that, Grant.
That's for sure. And what George Osborne has delivered for BlackRock is their massive investment in Uber. He was the one with Cameron who told Boris to leave Uber alone. He's the one who's allowed Uber to put 120,000 private hire drivers that are earning £4-5 an hour, having to have their wages topped up by benefits. And this is a company worth $90 billion globally. That is the payback, George. They're looking for their investment to grow at the expense of us moving back. I don't call it the gig economy. It's like modern day slavery, George. It's a slavery economy. It's not a sharing economy. It's a shafting economy. And all honest taxpayers are getting shafted, George. It's a disgrace. And Blair, he's not a Labour man. I'll never look at Tony Blair as a Labour man. He's a Conservative. He was never Labour, George. He was never left.
Grant, this has been a truly fantastic first call. There's never been a better first call on this show, and I'm really grateful to you for making it. In this first hour, we've been concentrating on the economic collapse of the Conservative government's budget. Within 48 hours, they've had to make a major U-turn, pursued hotly by taxi drivers and white van men and other single or small business entrepreneurs who they, to borrow the phrase of Grant, who was on the phone earlier, who they shafted in breaching their own election manifesto. Now, there are many other issues. There's the opinion poll lead that the Tories nonetheless currently enjoy. We'll be looking at that with Professor John Curtis after the break, and we'll be talking to a couple of sages, actually, not just one, about Donald Trump in the third hour. But Phil is on the line from Liverpool and wants to talk about the government and lobbying. Go ahead, Phil.
Oh, hello, George. Lovely to speak to you. I'm a big fan of yours. Firstly, I admire you greatly. Just a quick point, George. What lobbying in the government, right? We hear about it and we shrug our shoulders at it. What I think there should be is a public inquiry into government lobbying. Who's earning? Who's spending more time lobbying than actually being an MP? If I agree totally that MPs now go into Parliament, do a bit of government work, and spend a lot of time, what can I do after government? Where can I go and work? How much can I earn? And I don't like it, George. Now, you're an old-fashioned politician. I'm not saying old, George, but you're an old-fashioned politician, along with many others, who are out to do the best for the people. Do you know what I mean? Well, I
appreciate that, Phil. Let me run one or two things past you. Stay on the line, please. First of all, in a previous scandal about lobbying, you may recall there were several high-profile casualties. MPs were effectively drummed out of the House, and some of the lobbying companies went burst. There was a register introduced, which was thought to be one means of controlling what's happening. It hasn't done, although it has taken the ugliest edges off overt lobbying by serving members of Parliament. That doesn't mean that Westminster isn't actually crawling with other individuals who are lobbying and who are not actually handing over brown envelopes with cash in it or sending people off for trips on yachts and so on. But the lobbyist is very much alive and thriving at Westminster. But what's taken the place of what we saw in the 80s and early 90s, Phil, is this revolving door that I spoke of. George Osborne, he made, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, an extremely advantageous tax arrangement with not just Google, but many other big companies. You could say sweetheart, but that sounds far too chaste. He rolled around in the topsy-turvy of the chaise longue with one big corporation after another, and allowed those corporations to satisfy themselves in their tax arrangements at the expense of the British Exchequer, in my view. Now, nobody gave George Osborne a brown envelope. He's a very rich man already. Nobody gave him a nod and a wink and slipped him the price of a pint. No, it didn't work like that. What's happened is that very soon after leaving the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer, the former Chancellor, George Osborne, has landed a job on a salary that would make your eyes water. £655,000 a year for 4 days a month work. Now, even if he was Einstein, even if he was the world's greatest entrepreneur, he'd have to go some to justify remuneration of that level. So you're left contemplating, as Grant was, whether this is a reward after the fact for the policies that he pursued when he was in office. And this is my point, Phil. It's impossible to avoid the suspicion that ministers are following policies with an eye, maybe two eyes, on what's going to happen to them once they leave office. Who's going to look after them once they leave office? And that is a knife at the heart of our democratic system, Phil. Because you will never know, never, whether the minister is saying and doing this or that because he or she thinks it's right, or because he or she thinks it will be extremely rewarding for them personally in the years after they leave office. And when you've got ministers increasingly young and with a lot of time to spend after being ministers, that becomes a problem that's very acute. Phil, over to you.
Well, George, I totally agree. It makes me angry. Now, I can make one suggestion. I'm not going to go on forever. Get your film camera out, as you have done in the past, and go and investigate it for us. Go and get stuck in. Do a fund. See who's earning now. See who has took the Michael. Get your film camera out, George, and we'll all back you. Let's go and get.
Thanks, Phil. Fantastic call. I really appreciate it. That was Phil in Liverpool. Let's try and squeeze in Joshua, who's in London, on a different subject, but nonetheless one I'm happy to talk about. Joshua, welcome.
Oh, hi, George. I can call you George. That's fine.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Yes, it's on the issue of Scottish nationalism, and like yourself, I'm against Scottish independence. I mean, I'm not a Scotsman myself, unlike you, but I'm against Scottish independence. But I do, like you, support maximum, or at least further devolution for Scotland, as I do a lot of parts of the UK. And like you, I agree with you on many things, such as the issue of Palestine, and also, well, you're probably guessing I'm not a Tory supporter or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I was just wondering, Mr. Galloway, and also like you, I'm also very much a Eurosceptic. I mean, I voted in favour of Britain leaving the EU. But I was just wanting to ask you, basically, about the democratic side of Scottish independence, because you argue that it's kind of hypocritical of the Scottish National Party to, even though it's very unlikely they're actually going to be let back into the EU because Spain will probably veto it. What I was going to ask you is, how do we persuade the Scots that it's actually going to be more democratic to remain in the UK if they're being taken out of it against their will, which I do think is unfair, even though I still think it's probably better to remain. I just think, how should we go about persuading them? Because, independence does seem a little bit more likely now, possibly more so than it did before.
I don't actually think it is more likely, Joshua, and I'm not even convinced that there will be an early referendum for reasons which I discuss tomorrow on my television show with a prominent former Labour minister from Scotland, Brian Wilson. You might want to check that out. You can follow me on Twitter and you can read all about it. I don't actually think that if there is a referendum that the SNP will win it, because I think the economic case for leaving Britain is weaker today than it was in 2014 when the referendum was last held. There's a number of problems. First of all, the SNP told us that this was a once-in-a-generation referendum, and 3 years is not a generation. 30 years is a generation. So there's the breach of trust issue involved in that. Secondly, how can you have a referendum on leaving Britain before you even know what the terms of Britain's departure from the European Union are? What if Theresa May and the EU reach a marvellous agreement? Why on earth would you have left Britain without knowing what Britain's relationship with the EU will look like? Thirdly, it's true that 60% of the Scots voted to remain in the EU, but that means 40% of them voted to leave the EU. And at least a third of the SNP's voters voted to leave the EU, some of them very big beasts indeed, like Jim Sillars, like Jim Fairley, two former leading figures in the SNP, are pro-independence but anti-EU.
Yeah.
Moreover, there are plenty of people, there are hundreds of thousands of people who wanted to remain in the EU but are against Scottish separatism. So to use their vote for the EU as a trigger to call a referendum on leaving Britain is deeply undemocratic. And lastly, I'll let you back in, Joshua. Lastly, you're faced with the task of persuading the Scottish people that they have more in common with Latvia and Luxembourg than they do with the people of England and Wales.
Which is ridiculous.
That's a very difficult mountain to climb. And when you say that you will leave Britain, which is a democratic country up to a point, when you will leave Britain and attempt to join a totally undemocratic EU, if they will let you, and you were right to identify the overwhelming probability that Spain, at least, would veto any Scottish application to join the EU, which would leave Scotland out of Britain and not in the EU. But even if you were allowed to join the EU, you'd have to wipe out an £11 billion a year budget deficit to meet the convergence criterion which new members of the EU have to meet. And they also have to adopt the euro. And not many people will want to see Scotland's public expenditure wiped out in order that we can join the euro, for which there's no popular enthusiasm. And lastly, Joshua, and this is the one that nobody else has the courage to talk about, but I do. I never met a Scot that is comfortable with the idea that Scotland in the EU would then receive the influx of free movement of labour from Eastern Europe and Central Europe that would no longer be able to go to England and Wales because we'd left the EU. The idea that Scotland is a nation of liberals just waiting with open arms for as many Bulgarians and Romanians as want to come to Scotland to look for work, to compete with them for work and wages, is utter nonsense. Joshua.
Yes, no, well, there were certainly a couple of things you said that I already did know, but certainly several other things that I didn't know about the £11 deficit, element. But,
£11 billion,
is that basically like a regulation criteria for the EU to...
Your budget must be no greater than 3% in deficit, and Scotland's is almost 13%.
So actually, you make the case for Scottish independence based on EU membership. Absolutely laughable, really, isn't it? To be honest.
I don't believe... You see, the Scots are not called canny for nothing. They know about money, they care about money, and they know when sums don't add up. Joshua, it's been a pleasure talking to you, albeit about something off-piste like Scottish nationalism, but it allowed me to say my piece. We talked in the first hour about the state of the nation's finances. In the second hour, we'll continue talking about that, but we'll be looking at the state of the parties as YouGov publishes its first big poll for quite some time, and with the doyen of psephologists, Professor John Curtis from the University of Strathclyde. Now, the headline is bad enough. It is that Labour is down to 25% of the voting intention of the British public in the first big YouGov poll. I think it says here, since Brexit. We'll ask Professor John in a minute if that is accurate, but it's certainly a big poll. poll. I'm told it's the first post-budget poll, which makes the results even more surprising. It puts the Tories 19 points ahead, and in a position where they must be regretting having passed the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act, depriving themselves of the opportunity of a dash for a quick general election at which, on these kind of figures, they would be re-elected with an overwhelming majority, with great significance and consequence for other parties, and maybe also for the state of the Union of Great Britain itself. But why listen to me talk about it when you can listen to an expert who really is an expert, Professor John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. Professor John, thanks very much for joining us.
Good evening, George.
Would you talk us through the headlines and lowlights of this poll, please?
Well, I mean, this poll is, in truth, but yet another poll that suggests that the Labour vote is gradually disappearing and the party is gradually slipping into greater and greater trouble. You're right, this is the first time that YouGov have had the Conservatives this far ahead since 2009. That's around the time of the MP's expenses scandal, when we actually had one or two polls doing Gordon Brown's darkest days with Labour at around 20% of the vote. Labour have not quite fallen back to that. But if you leave that period aside, this is now Labour's worst period in the opinion polls since, around the time of the Falklands War in the middle of 1982, and then indeed in the weeks immediately before the 1983 general election, when the party recorded its worst ever general election result. The truth is, and this is really a slippage that really can be dated from after the Brexit referendum, from around the time that the second challenge was mounted to Jeremy Corbyn. I think, in fairness to Jeremy Corbyn, one should say that for the first 12 months of his leadership, actually the Labour vote didn't fall. It didn't increase by very much, but at least it could be argued in his defence that some of the claims that he was immediately turning voters off voting Labour were perhaps a little bit too exaggerated. But since then, there is no doubt that Labour's vote's been falling. It's not unique to YouGov. It's been found by RSCM. It's been found by Ipsos Mori. The interesting thing, however, is that this slippage in Labour support isn't just something that's occurred across the board. It's particularly occurred amongst those Labour voters who voted to remain in the EU back in June of last year. And that must raise questions about whether or not the shadow cabinet and Jeremy Corbyn have somewhat misread the electoral challenge they have faced since the referendum. They've clearly been desperately concerned about losing votes to UKIP, when in fact most Labour voters voted to remain, and that's true even in the north of England and in the Midlands. Labour aren't losing very many votes to UKIP, but they are losing them to the Liberal Democrats, and they're also losing some to the Tories too. So I think maybe Labour have somewhat misread the challenge that faces them. But certainly one has to say that at the moment the Labour opposition is now, but frankly, in as weak a position as any opposition has been in post-war electoral politics.
We'll come back to Mr. Corbyn in a minute, but although it's beyond your purview, it's definitely not beyond your wisdom. Other Labour parties in Europe are in an even worse state. The Socialist Party in France, the president had to limp off the field with just 4%. In the Netherlands, they are in 4th or 5th place. In most European countries, social democratic, Labour-type parties are in a very powerless position, even though the economy, and we're told that more and more people feel that the elite have mismanaged affairs and so on, yet social democratic parties are not being the beneficiaries.
Yeah, and I think it's clear they face a pretty big challenge. One challenge, obviously, is that as we become more and more of a white-collar society, so the so-called traditional Labour voter, the traditional working-class voter who would normally be expected to be the core of any social democratic party support, is becoming less numerous. And indeed, if you look at the UK Labour Party at the last general election, only around 40% of its vote came from people who could, in any sense, be defined as working class. And I think sometimes when I hear Labour MPs talking about we need to look after our people, well, A, I go, so apparently you're not a part of our people, and B, by the way, do you realise that our people, as the way you define it, is now a minority of your audience? And that's perhaps one indication of how some Labour MPs might have touched. But the bigger challenge is, I think, undoubtedly, is that in the wake of the financial crash of 2008, the big question facing Social Democratic parties is, can you persuade voters, can you persuade particularly working class voters, those who are less well off in our society, that actually it is possible to ride the tiger of global capitalism in such a way that some of the inequities that are otherwise produced by that tiger are ameliorated, and that indeed everybody benefits. I mean, the basic assumption of social democracy is, well, look, we've got to live with capitalism, but we can manage it in such a way that actually some of the greater inequality is reduced, and everybody benefits. The difficulty, of course, is that just take the UK as an example. Inequality increased quite markedly, particularly in the 1980s. It hasn't got particularly worse more recently, but the truth is that New Labour weren't able to do a great deal to reduce it. And of course, meanwhile, because of the financial crash, many a person has not seen an increase in their living standards. And indeed, of course, the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Resolution Foundation are telling us that maybe we're not also going to see one for another 5, 6, 7 or 8 years. So against that backdrop, you can see why people are saying, well, hang on, these Social Democratic MPs who, A, they're terribly middle class, and they're not necessarily, obviously, people who we feel a great deal of empathy for, and B, who don't really seem to have some idea of how actually they can manage this economy that seems to be out of control, that caused the financial crash, that isn't delivering for me. You can see why they begin to look for other possibilities, including populist parties on the far right. And of course also, I mean, we've seen it also, of course, in Greece and in Spain with also populist parties on the left. So I think there is no doubt there's a big intellectual challenge facing social democracy, because the basic premise upon which it operates, shall we say, it's no longer necessarily clear that they are able to deliver what social democracy is meant to deliver.
Very well put. In fact, we could have written a book on that. Let me move on to the Conservatives, if I may, because one of the points that you made there about a turn to populist parties, right-wing parties, in nationalist parties on the European mainland, that isn't really happening here. UKIP, there was another local government by-election last night where I think they got about 6% of the vote. They failed to make the breakthrough in Stoke. They lost votes in Copeland. UKIP are imploding, which may have freakish individual characteristics, but there's no evidence of a turn in England to an English nationalist party like them. The Conservatives... No? Go on.
I think you're somewhat exaggerating UKIP's predicament, though I recognise some of what you say. I mean, let's roll back, George. If I had said to you in 2011, you know what, at the next general election, there is going to be this party led by Nigel Farage, which the Prime Minister has dismissed as a load of fruitcake and nutters. Actually, it's going to get 12% of the vote, and it's going to beat the Liberal Democrats, and you would have said, I don't believe you. And the truth is, I mean, you're right, it got squeezed in Copeland, and we need to come back to that, but actually in Stoke, it still managed to increase its share of the vote. And by historical standards, what UKIP are still doing of getting around 11, 12, 13% in the opinion polls is in truth quite remarkable. Now, and they face two problems. Problem number one, undoubtedly, is there's a battle going on for what we can call the Leave vote between the Conservatives and UKIP. And actually, much of the increase in Conservative support over the last few months has actually come from UKIP supporters switching to the Conservatives, attracted by Mrs May's relatively hard Brexit, as many people see it. The second problem, of course, is a personnel problem. It's always been a somewhat fractious ship that Nigel Farage managed to keep afloat. Now that he's no longer there, some of the divisions become more obvious, and of course they've already been through 2 leaders since he's left, and not entirely sure how long Mr Nuttall's going to last either. So there's undoubtedly a personnel problem there, and of course that in the end could result in the party imploding. But at the moment, at least, it's still, I think one has to say, it's still alive and kicking. The big thing that party has, the big mistake it's made, it's the converse of the mistake that Labour made. UKIP thought that they could make advances by trying to win over working class Labour voters in the north of England and Midlands who voted to leave. The brutal truth is there aren't enough of them. And the reason at the end of the day why UKIP failed to win Stoke was because of their failure to squeeze the Conservative vote in that constituency. But of course, going around saying we're going to be the working class party of the north is not exactly the best way of appealing to middle class voters in a city like Stoke. So I think UKIP certainly have to rethink their strategy, because otherwise they need to squeeze the Conservatives, or otherwise, as happened in Copeland, they are going to be squeezed by the Conservatives. But they need to understand where their opportunity and their enemy is, and frankly, it's not the Labour Party, it's the Conservatives.
One last question, if I may, and I'm grateful for your time, John. Going back for a moment to Mr. Corbyn. On one poll, before the second leadership challenge, the Labour and the Tories were more or less a dead heat. I think they were both at 33%. Labour are now at 25%. With your professional hat on, because I find it difficult to be dispassionate about this point, is the challenge a significant reason? Not so much the challenge, but the ongoing noises of the kind of subversion, grinding subversion day by day of Corbyn, fatal. Is this going to be 24, then 23, then 21? Is there any prospect that you can see that Jeremy Corbyn can turn this around?
Well, I think my answer to that, George, is to point out what it seems to me what he hasn't managed to do. Here is somebody who is meant to be the figurehead, at least, the rhetorician, at least, of a substantial social movement of people who want a more equal society, who are concerned about nuclear weapons, a movement that actually believes in a distinctive body of ideas. But I think what's been remarkable about the last 18 months since Jeremy Corbyn leader is how little of that we've heard from him. And the truth is, having captured the Labour Party, one's beginning to ask oneself, well, hang on, what are Jeremy Corbyn and those around him doing other than desperately, tactically, from day to day, working out how to hang on to control of the machine that they've captured? Not entirely clear to me that they've worked out how to use it. And so we have this remarkable situation of apparently the Labour Party being run by people with a distinctive set of ideas. But I think the truth is, if you were to ask most people at the moment what the Labour Party stands for, you're going to get a lot of blank faces. Meanwhile, of course, now the question that always surrounded Jeremy Corbyn was, well, was it going to be possible for somebody who was a lifetime backbencher, and one could say in many respects is a very successful lifetime backbencher, could he turn it around in such a way that actually he demonstrate the qualities of leadership? Well, in the end, his real basic problem is that it's pretty clear that a large section of the MPs behind him don't think he's managed to do that, and it's very, very clear that a large section of the public don't think he's managed to do that. And I think, in truth, unless he pretty rapidly is actually able to lay out a vision and to work out how he's going to get his party together and to begin to persuade people he's actually got something to say, then it could well be the case that things will just simply slip from underneath him. Certainly, one's beginning to get the impression that certainly some of those around him and perhaps some people inside the Labour Party who supported him in the past are just beginning to ask themselves, where is this going to go?
Professor John Curtice, thank you very much indeed for your wisdom, your experience and your psephological brilliance. Professor John Curtice from the University of Strathclyde. This is the mother of all talk shows. Well, lots to digest from Professor Curtis about the specific case of Jeremy Corbyn, the general case of Labour and Social Democratic parties in today's post-crash world, where people, Professor Curtis thinks, are unconvinced that in the collapse of capitalism, the Social Democrats have an alternative project that is credible. I do think that there is something in that, and that's why I don't consider myself to be a Social Democrat. But that's another matter. 0344 499 1000. Let's hit the phones. Stephen is in Welwyn Garden City. Go ahead, Stephen.
Hi, George. Pleasure
Hi.
to speak to you. Pleasure to speak to you for the third time. Yes. Oh, and
excellent.
Before I forget, if I forget at the end, is there any chance of you showing your film in the southeast of England? Because I know you've shown it in parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland, but are you likely to be showing it again in the?
Well, if someone puts it on, of course I'll come. But I mean, I don't know where in Welwyn Garden City or in the southeast that I could do it. But anyone who's listening and wants to put it on, we can definitely do that. Though not for the next few weeks, because I'm pretty busy on other things. But thanks, Stephen. And of course, you can buy it on, or you can rent it for $3.99 on iTunes or Amazon or other such sites. Anyway, Stephen, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, sorry to go off topic. It's not about the budget or anything, but it was about Blair, really.
Yes.
As you know, the new war memorial to our war dead in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I didn't see much of the coverage, either live or in the newspapers, but he seemed to cut a very solitary figure. From what I saw of him, he didn't seem to speak to anyone. I mean, maybe he did, and I didn't notice, but he seemed to be sat between two officers of the armed forces. I mean, he wasn't with the other ex-premiers or anything. I just wondered, did you think was it the right thing for him to do? Because on the one hand, I thought, well, you're responsible for two of those wars. I know it included the first Gulf War, which was under John Major, wasn't it? But I mean, Blair was responsible for the last two, so in a sense he had a duty to go. But on the other hand, a lot of the relatives seemed very upset that they were denied tickets to it, or that they couldn't attend, and they seemed to be, irritated that Blair was there. What was your opinion, George?
Well, I'm glad you brought this up, Stephen, because I've been boiling with indignation and rage about it ever since I saw the pictures of the scene where Tony Blair, who, according to the Chilcot report, not me, led us into an unnecessary war of, according to Chilcot, dubious legality, and our soldiers sent to war ill-prepared, ill-clad, ill-equipped, ill-armed, and therefore Tony Blair is responsible for all of that, and many of the service personnel and their families believe so, and they were banned, the families, from the event, and Tony Blair was there.
Really?
Yes, the families were kept away, were not allowed tickets for the event, but a ticket was found for Tony Blair, who, according to Chilcot, again, you know my own views and what I could say about it, Stephen, but I'll stick with Chilcot. Chilcot was very clear that this war was not necessary, that its legality was questionable, that it sent our forces into battle ill-clad, ill-equipped, ill-armed, and so on. So these are matters that Chilcot has already found, and they will shortly be the subject of individual and collective legal actions from forces' families about it. I was struck, as you were, by the fact that he looked haunted, but with Tony Blair, you never know if it's an act or not. He's a follower of the Bob Monkhouse philosophy that once you can fake the sincerity, the rest is easy. So perhaps he was faking the haunted look, the isolated look that was undoubtedly, from the pictures you saw and I saw, the case. And on the front page of the Times today, there's a picture which I tweeted, which doesn't just show Mr. Blair in splendid isolation, but shows the Duke of York in fits of laughter, gales of laughter, and with a lot of medals. He must have been a very brave soldier, Prince Andrew. I'm not sure how he earned those medals, but he was certainly wearing them. And I thought that was a pretty inappropriate face for such a memorial. Then I saw the memorial itself pictured, and to my absolute horror, the soldier in the foreground bears a remarkable similarity to the face of Tony Blair, which just made, yes, take a look, which just made the whole thing even more repugnant for me. I cannot accept that Tony Blair can be walking around in polite company with the so-called great and good, and can be earning money beyond the dreams of avarice, able to command the media at his every whim, to report every breath and comma of what he has to say. I cannot accept that. And I don't think that the families of the soldiers can accept it either. So I'm grateful to you, Stephen, for giving me this opportunity to get that off my chest, although I'll have to do it all over again tomorrow if anyone asks me. Stephen in Welwyn Garden City, many thanks for that. Now we're talking about the British economy and the British political scene. The YouGov opinion poll marks a new low for Labour, a new high for the Tories. We were discussing with Professor John Curtis what all of that might mean from his point of view. Let's go to Ben in East Grinstead, who's not happy with my comments, so we better hear from him. Go ahead, Ben.
Hi, George.
Hi.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Talk Radio for giving you a show. And
thanks.
It's wonderful.
I thank them daily.
I bet you do, yeah. I'm frustrated and annoyed with John Curtis. I believe we're all the time a constant belittling of Corbyn, and he has proposed. Your guest was implying that he hasn't proposed anything, and that's absolute rot. The truth is that the mainstream media doesn't present it as if Corbyn is presenting. I know about some of his policies, the National Investment Bank. I can't list them all now, but and it irritated me that this show, which I love, was again following the same pattern of belittling Corbyn.
Well, I'm certainly not belittling him, and you and I can talk for as long as is interesting to the listeners about what John Curtis said. I don't actually think that Curtis was belittling him. He acknowledged that until the coup last summer, and which followed quickly on the Brexit vote and was deliberately timed to clash with the report from Sir John Chilcot, that Labour and the Tories were roughly equal in the polls, but they're not now. And we would be living in denial, Ben, if we didn't acknowledge that. There's lots of room for argument as to how we reached this stage, and the stage is yours now, the conch is yours, to tell me more about how you think we got here.
Well, look, why I don't understand why you and John Curtis are putting such stock in the polls. We all know the polls were wrong. You said it. Why they were wrong in America, and they were wrong here constantly. Why are you obsessed with believing the mainstream media is telling us those are the and they're probably rigging it anyway. I think you're being a bit Westminster-centric. And
well, I'm seldom accused of that, not least because I'm sitting in Stoke right now. But the election results in the last few weeks do not seem to suggest that the polls are wildly wrong. I'll put it no higher than that, Ben.
Okay, yeah. Okay,
you see my point?
Yes, I do. You're right.
Of course, there's a lot of contrary evidence. I myself put to Curtis that Labour had a fantastic victory in a local government by-election just last evening. UKIP collapsed. There was a swing to Labour. I think it was in double digits. I'll dig it out later.
I didn't know that. Fantastic.
There are frequently local government by-elections where Labour does extremely well.
Yeah.
But there are parliamentary by-elections like Copeland where Labour did not do well. And in the case of Stoke, where I'm sitting, they did well enough to hold the seat, but not as well as they ought, given the state of the national finances and the state of the government that Labour is facing. And the opinion polls may be right, they may be wrong. I suspect that the answer is somewhere between those 2 points. They're like the curate's egg. They're good in parts and bad in parts. But I think the points you make about the mainstream media are absolutely correct, but also absolutely predictable. It could not be predicted other than that the mainstream media would rubbish a left-wing leader of the Labour Party.
Exactly,
after all, they rubbish all leaders of the Labour Party. Ed Miliband was no socialist, but he got a very difficult time off the media. Neil Kinnock got a very difficult time off the media. Gordon Brown got a lot of difficulty with the media. The only Labour leader who's had the media on his side was Tony Blair, and that's because he wasn't a Labour leader.
Exactly.
It's because he was an anti-Labour leader. And so it was entirely predictable that this would be so. And this is where the mass movement comes in. Corbyn can never be gainsaid that Corbyn has led a vast increase of members of the Labour Party. The membership has tripled. It's the biggest party in Britain. It's bigger than all the parties in Britain put together. It's bigger than any social democratic party, not just in Europe, but anywhere in the world. But where are they, Ben, on the ground, in the campaigns, turning people's public opinion around? Are you satisfied? Because, look, there's been 2 selections of parliamentary candidates. My last point, and I'll let you in. There's been 2 selections of parliamentary candidates in Copeland and in Stoke, and Corbyn supporting candidates have lost both of them. And that seems to me to indicate that whilst on paper Jeremy has hundreds of thousands of supporters in the Labour Party, you've kind of got to turn up to the meetings if you're going to make that mean anything.
Absolutely. I think I think there is movements amongst people. I'm an anti-fracker, and which aren't just about political parties and turning up to meetings. And I'm hopeful about that movement. It's democratic. I think Copeland was a special case, and that brings me to a point I wanted to make, George. I'm really disappointed about your attitude about nuclear power. What price would you put on the Fukushima poisoning of the Pacific at the moment, constantly, daily? Why do you support nuclear power?
Financial price? Well, I think I'm like Jeremy Corbyn, your leader that you support. I think that nuclear has a part to play in a portfolio. Well, Jeremy thinks so, and so do I, Ben. But unfortunately, it's a subject too big for the moments that I've got left. But I promise you, we'll bring that subject up in the next few weeks, and I'll have you back on at a better length to discuss it. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Ben in East Grinstead can tweet me, as Unity March News has. making the point that the Labour candidates in Copeland and Stoke were not Corbyn supporters. Both were anti-Corbyn. A point I think I made myself very clearly in the run-up to those elections and even this evening in the discussion. But here's a conundrum which some of the Corbyn supporters currently tweeting me are not really answering. First of all, how is it possible, if hundreds of thousands of Labour members support Jeremy Corbyn, that in one by-election after another, a non-supporter, or in some cases an enemy of Jeremy Corbyn, is selected to be the candidate? That doesn't make sense. Now, partly, but only partly, it's because Corbyn does not control the Labour Party machinery, does not control the Labour National Executive, and that's not his fault. But what is his fault is that he doesn't talk about it. He doesn't try to change that in any meaningful way. I don't want to talk about forthcoming by-elections, but there was a coup in Labour's National Executive just the other day. Yet another coup, led by the same old faces, led by the usual suspects. And they were successful in that coup by one vote. And Jeremy Corbyn was not at the meeting. If he had been at the meeting, the coup would have failed. Now, it's not his fault that the majority of the NEC are against him, but he ought to be saying and doing much more about it. That people are going to the gallows, to expulsion on utterly fatuous, fake grounds. And Jeremy Corbyn doesn't say anything about it publicly. Now, he has a problem, of course. He's damned if he does, he's damned if he doesn't. But if I was Jackie Walker, about to be politically hanged, expelled out of the Labour Party for anti-Semitism, when she's Jewish and the words that she said could not possibly be construed in that way, I'd be wanting Jeremy to stand up for me just a little bit more robustly. More importantly, if the Corbynistas are going to change the makeup of the Parliamentary Labour Party, well, they better be more successful in deselecting existing MPs than they have been so far in selecting Labour candidates. Do you get my drift? Now, I was going to take John and Hamilton, but John, hang on, because just as Privy Councillors get priority in the House of Commons, so do legends here on the mother of all talk shows. And therefore, the legend that is Damien in Brighton is up first. Go ahead, Damien.
Good evening, George.
Hi.
George, I'd like to talk about the latest YouGov opinion poll, which puts the Conservatives at 44 points, 19 points ahead of the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Now, I was listening very closely to the points that were made by your expert guest and professor about the polls, and the thing that I noted was that his assessment moved directly from the polling numbers to international economic macro issues as the basis for his explanation of those polling numbers.
Yeah, sure, that's his opinion. He's a professor of politics. You're right, these were not in the YouGov poll, but I asked him to enlarge, thinking that it might put the Labour Party in a better light onto the European level. Go on, Damien.
Well, I mean, there was one thing that I found very interesting, George, and I think it was a glaring omission from the data set that he was basing his views upon. And of course that glaring omission was the ballot box, actual votes. So if we look at it this way, I mean, are we seriously to believe that the Conservative Party, which is a party that has been defeated in 7 out of 10 parliamentary by-elections since the last general election, and also let's remember as an aside that in that general election they scraped home with a wafer-thin majority on a low turnout. And also it's worth remembering that in the previous general election they couldn't even win a majority.
And let me add something, Damien.
Yeah.
There are potentially police charges looming in several constituencies that the Tories did win because of big question marks involving 8 police forces about voter fraud or expenses fraud.
And that's a highly pertinent point, George, and I thank you for reminding me of that, because it is a very, very important point to make. So they've been defeated in 70% of parliamentary by-elections they've taken part in. They have been defeated in every mayoral contest, including London. They've lost over 50 council seats, and they lost an unbelievable majority of 23,000 votes in the Richmond by-election. So my question really is, are we seriously to believe that a party that has such an abysmal record and long list of electoral defeats is sitting at 44 points in the polls, George? I mean, that's simply not a credible proposition, is it?
Well, that's why you're a legend, because you make calls like this. It's perfectly true that the only piece of data on which you can predict that the Tories are doing well, not even as well as the opinion poll, was their capture of the Copeland seat. Their vote didn't change in Stoke, where I'm sitting. They have lost all these by-elections, including the stunning by-election reversal in special circumstances, but not that special. Everybody knew that Zach Goldsmith was the Tory, even if he was running as an independent. The Tories were not opposing him, and they lost it to the Liberal Democrats. So the only constituency that can be identified, isolated for this discussion, is Copeland. That too had very special circumstances. First of all, it was a constituency in which Labour had been scraping home for several previous elections. Secondly, it was a constituency unusually dependent upon one industry, a controversial one, namely the nuclear power industry. If you look at the constituency, as I said at the time, Damien, it was a very rural, seaside constituency, not a Labour heartland at all. It had been a Labour seat since 1935, but even Jack Cunningham, a Labour grandee, scraped home in that very same constituency. Fourthly, its MP deserted it like a rat jumping out of Parliament into the nuclear industry, doubling his wages in so doing, having spent the last year and a half rubbishing the leader of his own party. And so in all those circumstances, that the Tories managed to capture Copeland was disappointing, especially given the NHS issues in the constituency, was hardly earth-shattering. Am I right?
You're right, George. I mean, you just completely deconstructed the whole Copeland result, and I guess the point I'm making here is that, you know, whilst not completely writing off polling, I mean, it can prove to be a useful exercise, I'm sure, but all I'm saying, I guess, is that I'm highly sceptical that, I mean, I think first of all we can, you know, bearing in mind the facts that both you and I have presented this evening, that polls have a margin of error of 3%, we can take that 3% off straight away, and I think there's other further data integrity questions which need to be asked about these polls. The methodology is, they're either on, I believe this one was online, and so you're obviously going to have a demographic of people who are politically active online, which is not representative of everyday people. You also get a lot of these polls which are done by mobile phones, so you can't actually verify who's at the other end of the line, because people are using mobile phones much more than they're using landlines these days. But so the point I'm making is I'm highly sceptical of these numbers, and it seems as if my scepticism is shared by the Prime Minister, because clearly, if she believed the polls, she'd have already gone to the country.
Well, she couldn't, of course, without Labour's agreement, given the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, which now precludes that, but she'd be asking Labour for their endorsement of an early general election. That's true.
No, I appreciate that. Sorry.
But one last point,
yeah.
Damien. We're not denying that the Labour Party is in a very difficult situation. How could it not be? Its leader is day and daily destabilised, subverted, maligned, defamed by his own members of Parliament. When he was speaking in reply to Hammond in the budget debate, everyone could see the absolute treachery of the Labour MPs sitting behind him, who instead of listening, maybe even cheering what their leader was saying, were looking at their mobile telephones, almost every one of them. And those who weren't were sitting sullenly, making it absolutely clear with their face and their body language that they didn't want to be sitting there behind the twice elected leader of the Labour Party.
George, could I make a final point?
Yeah.
The Labour Party, after 9 months of Jeremy Corbyn being the leader, were almost neck and neck with the Conservatives. In fact, the Conservatives had just dropped 5 points and the Labour Party had gained 2, and were on track to overtake the Conservatives. Now, it is my belief that having failed to be able to pin anything on Jeremy Corbyn about electability, because he'd won every election that had been put in front of him, having failed to undermine him on the principle of leadership because he tripled the membership of the Labour Party, they went for him on the polls, George. And the plotters in the Parliamentary Labour Party intentionally set out to damage the Labour Party's polling, which they did as soon as they started their hourly resignations. The polls dropped, and we're now 15 to 18 points behind the Conservatives. And that was their objective, George. And they've been successful. However, there is light at the end of the tunnel, because, of course, if we look at Senator Sanders' example, Senator Sanders was 60 points in deficit to the centrist candidate Hillary Clinton, who had the backing of the establishment and the backing of billions of dollars of funds from corporate donors. He pulled that deficit back in a year.
Well, Damien, that's why you're a legend. That was a superb call, a tour de force even by your standards. Thanks for joining us, and my apologies to John in Hamilton. We'll talk to him after the break, and I'm sincerely sorry that I kept him waiting, but I thought the public that are listening would appreciate Damien from Brighton's brilliant contribution to the debate this evening. We're discussing, of course, the British economy. We're discussing the British political scene. With as a peg, the YouGov opinion poll, in the absence of a by-election to discuss. It seems entirely reasonable to discuss an opinion poll. But all the caveats that have been made by Ben and by Damien, both on the South Coast, hardly Labour heartland territory, were very, very well made, in my opinion. In the third hour, we'll keep discussing these issues, but we're throwing in the clown that is Donald Trump and the circus that he's running in Washington, D.C. This is the mother of all talk shows. Donald Trump continues to sally forth on Twitter and on press conferences galore. He's making public appearances by the score. I sometimes wonder if he ever sits down at his desk and does any actual work. Certainly, just like the Jeremy Corbyn that we were talking about earlier, he's got the mass media and the deep state very, very definitely against him. The intelligence community in particular is causing him no end of problems, and an amazing number of liberals are ready to forgive and forget the history of US intelligence communities in subverting and overthrowing governments abroad. bugging the telephones of friendly leaders. Trump got quite a tanking for saying, so far without evidence, that President Obama was tapping his phone, but as Private Eye put it, I thought perfectly today, he didn't tap Donald Trump's phone because he was too busy tapping Angela Merkel's. That, of course, is no longer denied, wasn't even denied forcibly on the day that the announcement was made, and an apology was forthcoming from the aforementioned President Obama for tapping the personal cell phone of the Chancellor of the German Republic, possibly the United States' most important ally. And the US intelligence community has bugged and burgled its way across the world, including, as WikiLeaks revealed this week, through the Samsung smart television sets, even of its own citizens. So anyone who embraces the activities of the US intelligence communities is, I think, very unwise, very foolish indeed. But so is Donald Trump. And he's in all sorts of new difficulties. As I said earlier, I met General Mike Flynn in Moscow a year or so ago. I didn't make a song and dance about it at the time or subsequently because it seemed to me he had enough problems on that score. I don't believe for 1 minute that General Flynn was an agent of the Russians, but he definitely was an agent of the Turks. As he has now belatedly confessed, he was being paid over $500,000 a year to lobby for the government of Erdogan in Turkey, except he didn't tell any of us. He didn't even tell President Trump, who appointed him as his national security advisor. Therefore, if Flynn had not resigned over the Russia imbroglio, he would now have had to resign in disgrace and probably with criminal charges to follow for the failure to reveal that he was an agent of Turkey, all the while strutting around the political stage in Washington. And then there's Attorney General Sessions. There's no other way of saying this. He was economical with the truth in the extreme, in the answers he gave his confirmation hearing about his contact with Russian officials in the months prior to the confirmation hearing. Now, again, I have no problem about people meeting Russians. I myself meet them all the time. So did Hillary Clinton's camp followers all the time. Leading members of the Senate and the House on the Democratic side met the very same Russian personnel that they're trying to hang Trump's appointees for meeting. But if you're asked a question at your confirmation hearing, you have a duty to answer it truthfully, especially if you are the putative Attorney General of the United States and the head, therefore, of their legal system. Now, two men who are both Republicans, but who have a different take on President Trump, are presented now for our delectation and for our education. They are my old friend Charlie Wolf, formerly of this parish, who is from Republicans Abroad, and John Le Boutillier, a former Republican congressman turned talk show host and all-round sage who's guided us over many years through American affairs. Let me go across the Atlantic first and ask John Le Boutillier how he sees the current state of affairs in Washington. John, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, George. Thank you. Nice to talk to you, Charlie, in a second, I hope.
Yes, I enjoy you on the television, by the way. I do watch you on Fox, or I have in the past, with the other guys debating politics, and very much enjoy it.
Well, you two are welcome to talk amongst yourselves, but talk to me first. John Le Boutillier, can you hear me, John?
Yeah.
I hear you fine.
By the way, John, I'm looking through George's television right now. I can tell you, George, I've seen you in better hats.
Now, Charlie, I can't make contact myself with John at the minute, so let me talk to you first, if I may.
Yes.
How about my summary there? What would you give it? 5 out of 10? 6 out of 10?
Yeah, I'd say about 5.5. I didn't hear all of it. I'll disagree with you on the Sessions, on the Jeff Sessions piece. That is pretty much a distraction and a non-starter. It's interesting. I was speaking to a foreign editor recently of one of the news organizations here in London. I won't say who in the one breath said he felt that the Trump administration was tainted with Russian money and some sort of scandal. He wasn't quite sure what, and I'm not sure if I agree with him, but in the same breath, said no. He said the Sessions thing is a non-story. You've got to understand the actual question that he answered, and it was not what I saw meant much of the press. The clip that they ran on the television or they had in the newspaper did not give all of Al Franken's question. The question was, and again, forgive me, I'm paraphrasing from memory, it was about extended exchanges of information or something along those lines. And as far as he was concerned, he saw this guy twice, once at the Republican National Convention, which, funny enough, someone described as a secret meeting. Well, he was with 11 other ambassadors. I don't think it was an extensive exchange of information. And another time in his office, which is also not part of the campaign. It was part of his role as a member of the Armed Services Committee. So that one was a bit of a non-starter. Now the Flynn story, I've only just kind of caught in the last hour or so myself, and I'm not sure what to make of it. I think it could be a little less than people are making of it, but at the same time, there's a miscommunication somewhere. Or maybe there's a little bit of inexperience on the Trump team's part, or again, it's a little bit of shitty workmanship. But yeah, that one is a little bit troubling, to say the least.
Now, what about the travel ban, Charlie? Has he recovered his footing on that? Will this new travel ban, excluding Iraq, will that pass muster with the courts?
I think the first one, for the most part, really should have as well. There was a couple minor glitches in it that they should have been able to fix instead of bringing on. By the way, they didn't get rid of the law. They had an injunction on the actions until the law was decided. They now, as you know, have revoked that executive order. So this is travel ban 2.0. And again, I get a little bit worried when the courts are interfering to that point, to that extent, in what should be the purview of the president. There were mistakes made. I think they were more in the process than the law. For instance, I can understand this desire to put something out immediately because you don't want to expose your hand to your enemy. But at the same time, when someone's in the air and you find out while you're in the air, and you have to turn back an airplane or what have you, that caused some problems. Not probably as extensive as people made it out to be, but yes, that the PR didn't work at all. There were some minor problems with the law. I would have waited maybe till Sessions was on board as his Attorney General, but I think this one should fix the problems, and I hope it does go ahead, yes.
What about the wiretapping? Now, this was, on the face of it, quite a rash claim, at least in the absence of any evidence proffered. However, as I've just said, there is no doubt that President Obama was bugging almost everybody in the world. So why wouldn't he bug Donald Trump?
Including the press, by the way. It was interesting how the press were all running to his defense and saying, whiter than white, if I can use the expression, President Obama. They forgot what he did to James Rosen of Fox News, and I know people are going to get a jump when they hear the name Fox News, but Rosen's a very respected reporter. Listen, the spying is as far as other nations are concerned. George, you and I, we've been around a while. We shouldn't be surprised. That's what we do, and it's understood. The Americans spy on the Germans, the Germans spy on the UK, the UK spies on the Americans, the Israelis spy on us, we spy on the Israelis, and that's just how it goes, and that's not a problem. But
now, okay, Charlie, let me hear from, as it were, a different wing of the Republican Party, John Libertillier, who's, I think, hearing me now. John, what's your take on the current state of affairs in Washington?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag. I think that governmentally, the first 50 days of Trump have been okay. I don't think they've been a disaster. I think the weak link in the Trump team is actually Trump himself, that all this crazy tweeting and statements and tangents that he runs off on take away from actually a pretty good cabinet and an agenda that is what the public asked for. Number one, revive the private economy through corporate tax reform and cuts, personal income tax reform, and regulatory reform. If they focus on that, number one, they're going to do well. The health care thing is shaping up to be a big problem for them, as I knew it would be, because they ran on 3 out of 4 national elections, the Republicans did, promising to make the health care system better. But what we've learned, which I knew all along, and now the public is learning, the Republicans promised that without ever having a plan. They don't have a plan. Until this week, they unveiled this plan in secret. They haven't even got it scored, so we really don't even know how much it's going to cost or whether it's going to work or not. And off we go with a rush job to get the thing passed by April 7th in the House of Representatives. That, I think, is a potential problem for them.
But John, can I ask, do you think someone like Trump, as the deal maker, as a businessman, it's like this hotel will be up on deadline kind of a person, do you think he could be pulled a rabbit out of a hat, at least to some extent, on this one?
No, I don't believe rabbits come out of hats, Charlie. I think that first of all, I'm not distressed over the people in the Republican Party arguing with Paul Ryan about the health care bill. This is part of the legislative process. It's going to take many months until they end up with something. But the something is what I'm worried about, is can we really come through with what Trump has promised, which was health care for everybody at lower premiums, lower deductibles, and better care for everybody? And the answer, of course, is no. It was a promise made out of ignorance. And we're going to be stuck with the consequences when, 15 million people are throwing off their insurance, costs keep going up, and people start looking around in a year and a half and go, God, it's even worse. Guess who's going to get the blame? The Republicans are going to get the blame. Obamacare will be an ancient memory by then.
Yeah, that's a true one there. But, at least from what I'm picking up over here, one news commentator was saying that, the retail politics, they're going out and going to the Congress and involving everybody. One of the problems with Obama was, of course, here was a bill that involved 20% of the economy. What was his famous line when he had the Republicans over that first week? And they were haggling over whatever, and he says, "Hey guys, I won." At least we seem to have a president who wants to engage and will go out and invite people. If he can have Ted Cruz over for dinner with his wife, then anything's possible.
Well, the lying Ted Cruz seemed to have supped at least with a long spoon at the Trump table. Or is he the liar, or was it someone else? They were all liars, according to Trump. But he does seem to have this ability to, kiss and make up, or at least a manly hug. John?
Oh, yeah, he does. I mean, you look at his appointment this week for John Huntsman to be ambassador to Russia. I mean, my God. They said awful stuff about each other up till this past summer. And here he's giving him one of the most important jobs in his foreign policy team. So, yeah, I mean, there is some forgive and forget. That doesn't bother me. I'm glad he's got some of that. But there's also a lot of people who are not getting jobs because they opposed Trump in the primaries. Case in point, Elliott Abrams, who worked in both Bush administrations, who was up for Deputy Secretary of State until Steve Bannon got into him, and they blew him off. And one of the little stories that's not getting a lot of attention is the entire executive branch is empty of positions. No one's filling them because the Trump White House is putting such a strict loyalty test to potential appointees that they don't have anybody. There's no Deputy Secretary of State, no Deputy Secretary of Defense. I'm not sure if there's definitely no Deputy Secretary of Commerce. None of these places have a guy to run the building yet.
John, finally...
That's not the end of the world.
John, finally, did President Obama bug Donald Trump's telephone, in your view?
No. I think what happened is the NSA listens in to every communication from Russia and from Russian intelligence and Russian business. They listen into all of it that's coming into America legally, without a warrant. And if on those communications they pick up Americans on the other end of the line, and those Americans happen to be working in the Trump campaign or Trump Tower, boom, there you go. And there's a communication that the government has. No bug, no tap, T-A-P-P as Trump spelled it. It's done through the modern way of doing it, which is NSA eavesdropping.
Charlie, finally, why don't you tell him to get off Twitter?
Well, in some respects it does work. I've never seen people talk about some of his missives. They get people in TV newsrooms now monitoring Twitter. That's their job, like at 3 a.m. So it is a fantastic tool that I think up there with FDR's fireside chats on the wireless. But yes, there are times when, let's put it this way. Donald Trump strikes me as one of the best and worst communicators of all time. He has an ability. Someone like yourself, George, you're a fantastic orator. It's sort of a one-way communication. He has an ability to communicate. It's a two-way communication, but occasionally, if you don't understand New York lingo, like for instance last night the riots in Sweden. Now I think what he was saying was last night watching Fox, I was watching riots. Now the riots could have happened 6 months ago. I don't know, but this is how New Yorkers talk, and you have to kind of have a way of understanding it. And you can ask John. I believe you're a New Yorker, yeah. So
unfortunately, we're out of time because I must take a break for some capitalist messages. But I'm deeply grateful to both of you. Thanks, John Labutillier and Charlie Wolfe. Let's go to John in Hamilton on the subject of Jeremy Corbyn. John, my apologies for keeping you waiting. What would you like to say?
That's okay, George. No trouble. You kept me waiting for the legend that is Adrian. Then you kept me waiting for the legend that's John Labutillier.
It's no shame. It's no shame, John.
It's been a day of it, George, because this morning I was waiting outside Celtic Park, waiting for the funeral of the real legend that is Tommy Gemmell.
God rest his soul, yes.
Yeah, but anyway, hopefully I'll get a suitable farewell with the result on Sunday. But
yes,
never mind. A quick point with Jeremy Corbyn, George. I'm more than willing to vote for Jeremy Corbyn, but I don't know what I'm getting now when I vote for Jeremy Corbyn. I know that I see his parliamentary Labour Party members, and they're obviously not behind him, the majority of them anyway. And I just wonder, even if Jeremy did get into power, how long he would last. And the people, I'm actually put off voting for the Labour Party now when I see the behaviour of the people in the Labour Party behind them that should be supporting them.
Well, I think you've made a very powerful point there, John. I mean, I, of course, would vote for Jeremy Corbyn if I lived in Islington North, but I wouldn't vote for Wes Streeting if I lived in Ilford. And I could go on, believe me, a long list of them.
Of course, I mean, the Labour Party in Scotland, as you know, is a basket case. So, I mean, if I vote for Labour up here, I'm voting for incompetence, basically. Whereas the vote would be for Corbyn himself. But, as I say, it's hard to vote for a leader when you know that his party aren't behind him. I heard, Harriet Harman, who had disappeared off the face of the earth, she was on another chat show 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Stephen Nolan show, and she was promoting a book, as you might expect. She was promoting her book, but she was asked 2 or 3 times outright if she thought that Jeremy would make a good Prime Minister, and she publicly refused to comment. She just said,
"That's just incredible. We've never been in such waters before, John.
Yeah,
it's never been the case ever that Labour members of Parliament would be on television refusing to say that people should vote." For Labour. And there's a great piece in Private Eye today, by the way, about her book. In that book, she reveals that in the run-up to the Iraq War, she was not shown the legal advice that the war was legal or not, on the orders of the Attorney General. She was Solicitor General.
Yeah.
Lord Goldsmith refused to show her the evidence. She made no attempt to independently verify what the legal position was. She did not say to the public or the party or the Parliament that she had been denied access to these crucial legal matters, and therefore was in complete dereliction of her duty to the Crown and to the Parliament and the people, and she never once turned against Blair or the Iraq War. What kind of a person is that?
Well, you know it better than I do, George.
I do.
Yeah.
John, you've been marvellous, and I'm really sorry that I kept you waiting and that the hour is so advanced that we can't talk for longer. Please call me again next week. You'll be prioritised. Good call from John in Hamilton. Let's hear from Janice in Somerset. Go ahead, Janice.
Hello, George.
Hi.
I'm really nervous about this. I wasn't sure whether I would speak, really. I was a bit, how are you anyway?
Oh, by the grace of God, I'm very good, thank you.
Very good, very good. And it was just, I wanted to talk about Jeremy Corbyn as well. And I agree with John. I think a lot of people, it makes you angry when you think of all these MPs like Harriet Harman who are actually doing the working people of this country harm. The working classes of this country great harm, and they are derelict. They are in dereliction of their duty. Because they're not opposing the Tories, which is what the Labour Party is supposed to be doing, and standing up for the working class. That was why it was created. So, I was just wondering if there's any way that these MPs can be recalled. As you say, there are lots of members. Every time I see anything like this happen, I look on Twitter and I'm saying, come on, where are you? Go to your constituency and complain about them, because it's unacceptable. It's not just disagreeing or anything. It's really doing harm, and the Conservatives, Tories, are doing great harm in this country. And these people, they paid goodness knows what, 75,000 a year plus expenses, and they're doing nothing. In fact, they're doing everything they can to stop opposition to the Tories. And I really think, what can we do? I actually am tabling a motion to my CLP, although I don't unfortunately live in the Labour constituency, but I am going to table a motion to the Central Labour Party to censure what they're doing, to censure, the collusion, the prevention of all the policies of Jeremy Corbyn's policies coming out. And it's not a matter of Jeremy Corbyn as a person. It's everything he stands for and, standing up for people. And that message needs to get out, and the Central Party are not. They're obstructing it anyway. They're absolutely obstructing it. And, I just feel that we have to, wherever we can, oppose it and censure them.
Look, I don't know why you were very nervous, Janice, because that's one of the best calls of the night, or any night, and all the more powerful because of the evident sincerity in your voice. I just reiterate a point I alluded to earlier, and was touched on by John in Hamilton. If you vote Labour, what are you voting for? If the person that's in front of you and that's asking for your vote is someone who supported the Iraq War, continues to support Tony Blair, supports the expulsion of Ken Livingstone from the Labour Party, opposes everything that Jeremy Corbyn says and does, who in their right mind would vote for that? If you were a socialist, how could you do that? Yeah. I couldn't. Anyway, Janice, don't be a stranger. That was a great call. Make sure you call me regularly, please. This is the mother of all talk shows. Running out of time now, so let me go straight to Bristol and the becoming legend.
Oh.
Norma. Go ahead, Norma.
Oh, I don't know. I just wonder what's the matter with me. Am I in a minority? Because I seem to be out of step with a lot of the things that people are against Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, honestly, the government, they actually smugly, verbally bully him in Parliament. I mean, never mind about his backbenchers. I thought it was awful the way they were.
Their behaviour was despicable. In any normal Labour Party, they would have been disciplined for their despicable, treacherous behaviour. But Jeremy's not in a strong enough position to do that.
No, I know, but I mean, in actual fact, the Tories were, they were smugly sort of verbally.
Well, you expect that from them.
Well,
they
know,
are Flashman and Co. They are Tom Brown's school days back to life.
But, you know, him and John McDonnell, they make a lot of sense to me. I mean, they cover what's happening in the country. A lot of people are suffering. Their policies, I know a lot about their policies. The housing, the NHS, and their policies trying to sort of like reduce the inequalities. They're so big at the moment with this Tory government. And I know what he stands for. And I mean, they're just so low in the opinion poll. And, if I was younger, I was a member of the Labour Party for quite a long time till I fell out with Tony Blair. And I'd be working damn hard.
Me too, funnily enough.
Pardon?
Me too, funnily enough.
I
joined the Labour Party 50 years ago. 50 years ago, in the autumn of this year.
Oh, I say, I worked very hard for the Labour Party, but anyway, that's another story. I just want a few more people to start saying this guy's all right.
Hear, hear. Well said, Norma. Let's go to Canada and hear from Marty on the subject of Donald Trump. Marty, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, George. How are you?
I'm good. Where in Canada are you calling from?
I'm in Vancouver.
Excellent.
Beautiful.
I was there not so long ago at the International Film Festival with my Blair film.
Oh, very good. I was there as well. I actually saw your film, so.
Okay, fantastic. Go ahead, Marty.
So I just wanted to quickly talk about the Trump and the circus that you mentioned, and I just wanted to bring up about the State Department and Rex Tillerson. Trump had never met Rex Tillerson before the election campaign, and turns out that Rex Tillerson is big friends with Vladimir Putin. He's actually received highest honor for a non-citizen in Russia. I believe it's called the Russian Order of Friendship.
Yes, I don't have it myself.
Yeah, you should, George. I'm sure you're deserving of it. But just carrying on with the State Department, it's important to know that, you know, Trump has basically gutted that department, and he's put Tillerson in. They've got rid of 4 top officials within the first week who had 140 years of diplomatic experience. You know, we're talking about guys who have served under both Democratic and Republican administrations. They're proposing to cut the budget by 40%. The daily press conferences that they've had for 50 years are now no longer daily. Very frightening yesterday. They're completely unaware that the Mexican Foreign Secretary was visiting, which is kind of like their primary function. So there is a bit of a circus going on in America here, and it just worries me. And I was just wondering about your thoughts on the State Department and why you believe he might
personally
have
think I don't know much about Tillerson, but I certainly prefer him to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton or Secretary of State John Kerry, who were extremely busy in the world, not planning to receive the Mexican Foreign Secretary, but spreading murder and mayhem across the globe. So I'm very glad that Tillerson is the Secretary of State and not Kerry, and definitely not Clinton. Some of these issues that you raise are important, of course, but they're not really our business. That's how I look at it. How America runs its government is a matter for the American people. And where the American people don't like how their government is being run, they're perfectly entitled to, and if they do, they shall have my support, oppose the way that the government is operating. I'm only interested in how this impacts on the rest of the world, and if you ask me, it seems to me that Tillerson's friendship towards Russia, if that's what it is, I suspect it was much more about business, because he did a lot of business in the oil industry and joint ventures with Russia. I want America and Russia to be on friendly terms, because the alternative to jaw is war, and moreover, Marty, a war that would mean the end of the world, don't you think?
Well, no, I completely agree. I think the media is getting a bit hyped up about the whole situation, and I completely agree with you. George, you talk a lot of sense, and the media is getting hyped away from this. But you're right. There could be terrible effects on the world, and I'm behind friendlier relationships with Russia, but they also have to give as well. They maybe pulling out of Ukraine or doing something like that. Where they're breaking international laws and norms. I've got nothing.
Well, I honestly don't think they are. I don't think they're in Ukraine. If you mean Crimea, then obviously that's a whole different subject. But the idea that Russia has invaded Ukraine is not true. It's, as Donald Trump would put it, it's fake news. But the coup regime in Kiev has certainly invaded eastern Ukraine and the millions of Russian-speaking people there. But listen, Marty, I need to take a break for the inevitable capitalist messages, but it's been a pleasure talking with you. And say hi to Vancouver, please, for me. Next up, from Canada, we go to Australia after the break. Well, just to show the worldwide reach of the mother of all talk shows, we go from Vancouver, Canada, to Rob in Melbourne, Australia. It's the Union of the English-Speaking Peoples. Rob, welcome.
Hi, George. It's the Five Eyes, George.
Fantastic. Good for you. Thanks.
You're becoming my Saturday morning ritual. I just wanted to update you on Glass-Steagall.
Oh, yes.
I've spoken to you a few times recently.
You have, yes, very interestingly.
Yeah, so two things. The stock market, the banks index in the US stock market had a hiccup yesterday because Donald Trump's spokesman, Sean Spicer, was asked by a reporter if Donald Trump would work with Bernie Sanders on restoring the separation of commercial banking from investment banking, which both of them campaigned on. And Sean Spicer said, yes, he would, because, of course, this is something that is notable about Trump, which your American guest commented on. He is happy to work with anybody, really, even someone as different from him as Bernie Sanders. But Glass-Steagall has a lot of bipartisan support right around the world, actually. People support it for different reasons, but everyone recognises that it was a regulation that worked. And in fact, I regard it as the most successful banking regulation of all time, right? There were no bank crashes when Glass-Steagall was in place because it stops the banks from being able, because the banks can't use deposits to underwrite their gambling, then it limits their gambling, right? There's a limit on it. Once they repealed Glass-Steagall and the banks could use those deposits for their gambling, that puts all our money at risk, but there was no limit to the amount of bank gambling the banks could do. And now derivative speculation is, $1,000 trillion worth around the world. It's ridiculous.
Wow.
So anyway, Sean Spicer said yes, he would, and then he was asked, is Donald Trump still committed to restoring Glass-Steagall? And Sean Spicer confirmed yes. And as soon as he said that, the bank stocks on Wall Street tanked a bit because this makes them nervous more than anything else. Since the crash, it's the thing that in America and the UK, they fought the most. Right? In the UK, they got ring fencing instead, so they could look like they were going back to that separation without actually doing it.
Yeah.
And in America, Obama blocked it for 8 years. Obama was in the
great
of
liberal.
Wall Street and made sure it's a great liberal. Exactly.
Rob,
he made sure it didn't get up.
I'm very interested in this subject, and especially in your analysis and description of it. But just because of the lateness of the hour, I need to press on. And a very good morning, Saturday morning, to you in Australia. Thanks for the call. Mario is a new caller in Somerset and wants to talk about Jeremy Corbyn, and he's welcome. Mario.
Hello, George. I have spoken to you before, but not from Somerset.
Okay.
For that. What I want to convince you of, and I know Jeremy is a long-time friend and comrade of yours, but what I want to convince you of is that it's time for him to go, unfortunately. And I say that as someone who voted for him at least the first time.
Okay, what's your reason for that?
So, if I had to put some reasons to you, I think they'd be the obvious. It's that he's clearly not going to win the next general election on present trends. And what we all want is for a Labour Party that can take power, because that's the only way it can affect changes. And there is talk about, and you put forward a lot of eloquent reasons and correct reasons for why he's not doing so well, the splits in the PLP and happenstance and various events. But what makes a good leader would be his or her ability to overcome those issues. And what's happening at the moment is Corbyn appears to be falling at every single hurdle. Whether it's in his budget response when he failed to pick up on the fact the Tories have broken their promise, whether it's losing in Copeland, whether it's having his own internal opponents selected as candidates in constituencies, it's really going nowhere. So what I'd suggest is that it would be time for him to go. And in my view, the only alternative would be to deselect Labour MPs, but that would only lead to their replacement by amateurs and inexperienced people, and you'd have...
Well, how professional do you need to be, Mario, like the ones that voted for the Iraq war? That as professional as that?
No, I see where you're coming from. I'm not a Blairite, and I'm not making a Blairite case necessarily, although I concede that it has some similarity. I'm not a proponent of the Iraq war, but you must know that to be an MP you have to have a high level of competence, you have to be a good orator.
Unfortunately, Mario, I know the precise opposite of that. If you had ever sat in Parliament, you would know that donkeys by the dozen are the order of the day. In fact, by the score, if not by the 100. You don't have to be competent to be an MP. People in safe seats, Conservative and Labour, for generations, have been very far from competent. We have the most incompetent Parliament now, today, that I have ever known. It's a Parliament of pathetic poodles. I read, again in Private Eye today, an account of, I think, the last Prime Minister's question time. I beg you to take a look at it, Mario, and tell me that you think that the parliamentarians therein, on both sides, are the paragons of competence and professionalism of your imagination. I promise you that you will not. Mario, just because of the hour, I need to press on. I'm grateful for your call. I profoundly disagree with it, and I'd love to have argued it longer with you. But I need now to go to Clive in Twickenham. Go ahead,
George.
Clive.
Hello there, George.
Hi.
I haven't spoken to you before, and I didn't know you were on this channel, but never mind.
Oh, yes. I've been here for a while now.
I'll program it in as from now.
Thank you.
And listen in regularly. But it's a lot to discuss, but as Jeremy Corbyn, I support him, and I hope and I got a strong feeling, that, well, I may be completely wrong, of course, but I don't think so. There's a good chance that he could win the next election. Who knows? Things change so quickly in politics. It's true what you just said about some of these MPs that are stupid. Yes, I think I could do as good as, or better than some of them, from what I hear.
I know lots and lots of people who would be better than the MPs that we've got. What do we want in an MP, Clive? We want someone who will, as an independent man or woman, view each issue, analyse it, come to a conclusion that they sincerely feel, and argue for it. That's what a Member of Parliament should do. Not somebody who's told what to do, paged what to do, texted what to do, ordered what to do. That's not a Parliament. That's a parade of poodles.
No, they have a chance just to say things, come back about when the Conservatives were in power, the 18 years they were there. The Tories, Conservatives are always saying about when Labour were in for 13 years, was it, or 12 years? Under Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. But they don't say anything back. If I was sitting there, I'd say, what about Thatcher and, Major?
Well, look, Britain's been going wrong for a long time, Clive. It's been going wrong since the First World War.
That's right.
We have been ebbing, weakening since the First World War. We had, for a brief period, in 1945 and then again in the middle to late 1960s, we had Labour governments that really changed things for the better. But all the other governments, so far as I'm concerned, have merely managed decline in our country or made that decline more rapid and more extreme.
Yes, and I can't understand any of it. In 45, you had Clement Attlee. He did an awful lot in 5 years after a 6-year war with no money about much. Lease Land was stopped by the Americans because the Conservatives didn't want us to get it, so that they couldn't do the things they wanted to do, Labour. They did an awful lot in 5 years, and the other 2 they were in. The rot set in when Churchill got back in 52, I think it was, 1952.
51.
51, that's it. They called an quick election, didn't they? Yep. They changed the boundaries. They got more seats, more votes, Labour, but they lost the election.
Just let me make one last point to you, Clive, because I've got one last call to take.
Yeah.
If Blair, with a gigantic parliamentary majority, or Brown, who inherited it, if they had taken my advice, face-to-face, frequently proffered, to introduce proportional representation into British elections, we wouldn't be having this conversation now.
No.
Because no Tory government would ever be elected in Britain again if we had the same kind of fair voting in Britain as they do on the European continent. Clive, you're a gentleman. Thanks very much for waiting. And my last call of the evening is David in Stirling on Europe. Go ahead, David.
George, I just need to say I've listened to your last calls and it's been amazing what you've said. It's been brilliant. Honestly,
thank you. It's been a great show, actually. Yeah, I must come to the Northwest more often.
You've talked total sense. Believe me.
Thanks, mate.
What I was wanting to say about, see what's happening with this European getting in, right? We knew the House of Lords, the House of Commons were going to vote it in the government's favour.
Yeah.
But the House of Lords, that's all bought and paid for, right? To keep us in there, you know what I'm saying?
And you've got Egypt, you've got Egypt, David, you've got Egypt cheering the House of Lords. A chamber stuffed with the putrefying corpses of the British aristocracy and flatmates and cronies and donors and puffed up potentates who are frustrating the will of the British people, 17.25 million of them, and you've got Egypt cheering them.
It's contempt. See, if you're up in court, that would be contempt of court. Because they're not going by the will of the British people. It's contempt. You know what I mean?
Well, it'll now come back to the Commons. I said here last week, I believe that the government should accept the amendment on the issue of the European citizens living in Britain. We should take the moral high ground and publicly state and put in the bill that no European Union citizen who's resident here will be asked to leave, even if the other European countries are not prepared as yet to reciprocate with us. But the it's totally corrupt, but I've only got a few seconds. I want to make this point, Dave. The Second Amendment cannot be accepted because to allow Parliament the final say on whether or not the deal that's reached should be accepted is a direct challenge to the referendum result. It's arrogating to a small group of people, only some of whom are elected, the power to overrule 17.25 million people, who've been joined by millions more, by the way, who now want us to get on with leaving the European Union as soon as possible.